Mrs. Proctor, can African countries replicate the development success in India or China, who developed in part due to the sheer size of their markets?
I think it's a very important question. Market power has made a very big difference to particularly China as it's gone through its rural transformation phase, and you can see this by the efficiency with which their 200 plus million small-scale farmers are supplying the large urban economies. But there are growing large economies, urban economies in Africa. Take the whole of the coastal West Africa, so Lagos through to the larger capitals north of Lagos, where you've got opportunity for very large markets, similarly with the large growing centres in East Africa. So I think we are seeing both urbanisation taking place, which is becoming a sort of a market pull, and we are beginning to see regional trade taking place, where people are able to trade between different regions in Africa. I would agree with you that pull is not as strong, and therefore there's a thinness in the markets which make it harder for the small-scale producers to actually get into these markets and to compete, and space for everybody. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't lessons to learn about the way in which different models have been constructed to help to link farmers to markets and to value chains. The lessons, some of the elements I think are very relevant. There's good business models coming out of China and of India, particularly India, on bottom of the pyramid, supplies of input and output servicing in rural areas for market development. So I think these models can be shared with partners in sub-Saharan Africa, and then the relevant pieces of them picked up and taken forward. But no, you can't replicate exactly what's happened in China or Brazil and say that's what you can do in sub-Saharan Africa. But there's some of the principles and some elements which are able to be considered for replication, for scaling up.
What is the role of civil society for the economic development of African countries?
Well, I think some of the strongest actors of civil society at the moment, it depends on how broad a definition of civil society you may be referring to, but if we look at the role of farmer organisations, many of the farmer organisations at the moment in Africa are not economic actors, economic institutions. They do represent farming households and farm families, but their voice is becoming increasingly vocal in the policy debate in terms of what shape of agriculture parts of Africa could have, what are the key issues concerning rural households and rural families. So I think civil society is critical, and farmer organisations are one example. But it's the social coalitions between organisations of civil society and those of economic enterprise, both large and small. It's the way in which these groups work together which actually are the ones which are likely to make an influence of the way in which economic development or territorial area development takes place. So they're part of a wider coalition of civil society actors with the formal sector actors.
What are the lessons for African countries in terms of social security?
Well, I think there are many social safety net programs in Africa already, in Malawi, in Ethiopia, etc., which are social safety nets, but they're not necessarily long-term programs such as pensions, support to elderly or disabled persons. A lot depends on how much a country can afford to pay, which is one of the issues. But we do see, for example, in South Africa, very, very strong social safety nets going beyond the safety net for very poor households into support for pensions and for unemployed persons and so on. So it depends really on how much a country can afford to pay. And social safety nets are critical to people's survival and to their well-being, and to intergenerational support, so that the young people, the children of those households or the grandchildren of those households can get good nutrition and good education. So it's not just a sort of a public good, shall we say, for, say, the elderly or the unemployed. It also affects the whole household and the future generation. So I think that they do matter. They're not a substitute for good employment and self-determination of economic well-being by households, but they're an important supplement to it and need to be managed well in that context.